There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Eggplant parmigiana is just one of those iconic foods. It's distinctly Italian. When chefs talk, they say, oh, my mother made this when I was 5. My grandmother, with no fire and no eggplant, she made this. This is not any of those things for me.
My grandmother's family moved to the U.S. from Bari, Italy back in the 1920s. She passed away when I was 10. My memories of her are of blueberry pies, big warm hugs, and one of her specialties, which was eggplant parmesan. She passed the recipe and process down to my dad, who in turn passed it on to me. Now, I've modified it slightly over time and will pass it on to my children. And if this continues, my descendants may add their own little flourishes to the recipe. And at some point, it will no longer be the same recipe my grandmother used to make. But the bases will still be there. There will always be egg, flour, cheese, and sauce, and of course, eggplant. How it is cooked may be different, though. I lightly fry mine before putting it in the oven. Somewhere down the line, someone with a maybe healthier outlook than me may opt to skip frying altogether and go straight to baking. Whatever the case may be, it all started with my grandmother, who probably learned it from her mother. I can imagine my grandmother and her sister following my great-grandmother's instructions, running back and forth in the kitchen, delivering ingredients, and watching the whole thing be put together. Everything starts somewhere. The origin of life isn't much different. It started somewhere. Whether it was in a warm little primordial pond, as Charles Darwin once suggested, or it came here as a stowaway on a meteorite. However it happened, that's beside the point. There was a time when a molecule replicated, changed, and allowed for selection forces to take over. Really not unlike my grandmother's eggplant. We now know the ingredients for creating a living organism is stored within DNA.
Our genes carry the instructions for ordering the amino acids of each protein. Those instructions are encoded in a messenger molecule, an RNA, depicted in this.
All right, that was a little bit dry. It's much more interesting than that. In fact, there's an entire episode on it. But let's start with a quick refresher. All plants and animals have cells, and packed within these cells, or within the cell's nucleus, are chromosomes which contain DNA. DNA is like my great-grandmother. It contains all of the instructions for creating an organism. Or in her case, an eggplant. In short, the sugar in DNA is deoxyribose. That's the D in DNA. Now, if you've ever seen pictures of DNA, you'll know it has 2 strands arranged into a double helix structure. The Na in DNA stands for nucleic acid. There are 4 nucleobases in nucleic acid. There's adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And I know I've said all this before, but it is worth repeating. Repetition brings familiarity. Like my great-grandmother instructing her daughters to collect ingredients to make eggplant, DNA also needs help to create an organism. And instead of eggs and flour, DNA requires proteins. And instead of daughters to collect the ingredients, DNA has RNA. And here's where things get a little interesting.
So the bricks of life, almost certainly those bricks were the beginning. Life started. It would be too much of a coincidence to think of the bricks being there and life starting with something else. The final outcome of the origin of life is the so-called LUCA.
That's Professor Christian de Duve, a Nobel Prize-winning Belgian cytologist and biochemist. Do you recognize the term LUCA? Well, if you go back a few episodes, you'll find one all about LUCA.
The last universal common ancestor, which is the form of life from which all known living organisms are descendants. So we have some idea what the LUCA was, because all we have to do is to look at all forms of life on Earth, and what they have in common must have been present in the LUCA. I'm simplifying a little, but that basically is the same. So we have to find how it worked out. Now, from the bricks to LUCA, there was a very long pathway which we know hardly anything of, except we have a fairly good idea of an intermediate in that pathway, and that's RNA.
Remember I said things get a little interesting. This is where. It all has to do with DNA's little helper, RNA.
Because RNA almost certainly came before DNA, for reasons that are well known now, and RNA certainly came before proteins, because proteins are made by RNA. Even today, protein molecules are made with the help of RNA catalysts, transfer RNAs, messenger RNAs, and the ribosomal RNA that serves as a peptidyl-transferase.
Before we get into why it's so interesting, let's focus for a moment on RNA and how it's different from DNA. Now, instead of the sugar molecule deoxyribose, RNA is just ribose. That's the R. The Na still stands for nucleic acid, but the nucleobases have one difference. There are still 4, but instead of thymine, RNA has uracil. RNA is also a single strand, unlike DNA's double strand. And that's the basic difference. But what does it do? What does RNA do? It collects the ingredients according to DNA's recipe book. And to do this, there are 3 specialized forms of RNA. There's messenger RNA, or as it's sometimes called, mRNA, which is located in the nucleus with the DNA. Then there's transfer RNA, also known as tRNA, and that floats around in the cell's cytoplasm, which is outside the nucleus. And then there's ribosomal RNA, or rRNA, which is also located in the nucleus. Now, to keep it simple, messenger RNA copies bits of genetic code contained in DNA and delivers it to the factory which creates the proteins needed. These factories reside in ribosomes. The transfer RNA takes the instructions delivered to the factory, and it collects the amino acids required to make the proteins requested. These amino acids are brought back to the factory and handed over to the ribosomal RNA in the ribosome factory. Think of it kind of like the factory's foreman. So far, so good? All right, now back to why all this is interesting. It all has to do with what came first, the chicken or the egg. Or in this case, RNA or DNA as it relates to the origin of life. So here's a little bit of a conundrum. DNA requires proteins to do its thing, and proteins need DNA to exist. In the 1960s, Francis Crick, who also was one of the co-discoverers of DNA, Carl Woese and Leslie Orgel, or Orgel, I'm not sure which way it is, but anyways, they put forth the idea that RNA came first. According to the group, RNA had everything it needed to store genetic material and replicate. The problem was that it broke down easily. So in order for this to work, those RNA molecules would have had to form quickly. Eventually, the hypothesis goes, RNA could form faster than it broke down. When it began to self-replicate, it spread even faster. And over time, those RNA molecules, better at replicating before breaking down, persisted. That's natural selection. When DNA and proteins entered the picture, the storing of genetic material was passed over to them as they were more efficient and stronger. So there are a few problems with this. When and how did the process of storing genetic material pass from RNA to DNA? What happened to that entire RNA process? And perhaps more importantly, what happened to the RNA self-replication process? Today it doesn't exist in nature, and even if we can prove it to be possible, it doesn't mean it happened. So this hypothesis actually has a name. It's called the RNA world hypothesis, and it was given that name in 1986 by molecular biologist Walter Gilbert. The other problem with this hypothesis was one mentioned a few moments ago. RNA is extremely fragile. Even if it evolved to be, more cohesive, it was still difficult to see how RNA could catalyze chemical reactions. But in the 1980s, something else interesting happened. The first ribozyme was discovered. A ribozyme is an RNA enzyme that can catalyze a chemical reaction. So, the jury is still deliberating. And this is the wonderful thing with science. It's a constant journey of discovery. It leads down one path only to self-correct and show us another path. Even if we've journeyed down the first path for a long time, it will flash a big sign to get our attention to let us know we have to go back and start again. It's at this point I'd like to give Carl Sagan the final word today.
There are many hypotheses in science which are wrong. That's perfectly all right. It's the aperture to finding out what's right. Science is a self-correcting process. To be accepted, new ideas must survive the most rigorous standards of evidence and scrutiny. The worst aspect of the Velikovsky affair is not that many of his ideas were wrong or silly or in gross contradiction to the facts. Rather, the worst aspect is that some scientists attempted to suppress Velikovsky's ideas. The suppression of uncomfortable ideas may be common in religion or in politics, but it is not the path to knowledge, and there's no place for it in the endeavor of science. We do not know beforehand where fundamental insights will arise from about our mysterious and lovely solar system. And the history of our study of the solar system shows clearly that accepted and conventional ideas are often wrong, and that fundamental insights can arise from the most unexpected sources.
All right, I'm hungry. Who wants eggplant? I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to support the show at evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.